Thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Artbeat Studios. Artbeat specializes in printing high-quality metal, canvas, and acrylic prints. Make sure to check out the link down in the description if you're a photographer that wants to print your work. Editing realistic-looking landscape photos is a lot easier said than done, especially when you want those images to do justice to the scenes that you're photographing. I'm Austin James Jackson. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to create images that are both more visually compelling and that look realistic. I spent much of my professional photography career trying tons of different editing techniques, and like many others, I spent years over editing my images in a way that just didn't look realistic in my opinion. In the last couple of years, I've really dove deep to learn techniques to help dial in my editing style, ultimately producing images that I feel like look realistic and do justice to the scenes that I'm shooting. Let's jump right in and talk about tip number 1 when it comes to creating visually compelling and realistic looking images. The first tip is to avoid the contrast slider completely and instead use the curve. When we're talking about the contrast slider, I'm talking about the global contrast slider. No matter where you edit your images, there's most likely a contrast slider that adjusts the contrast in the image. Instead, I'm recommending that you use the curve or the tone curve, depending on where you edit your images. This can be called a lot of different things, but the curve essentially allows you to customize the amount of contrast in your scene. The problem with the normal contrast slider is that it adjusts contrast equally across the board. Your darks will get darker, your brights will get brighter, and they'll do so equally, which is usually not good. Unfortunately, very rarely is this going to result in the best contrast adjustment for your image. While the curve does take a bit more knowledge and finesse, it can be easily learned and even mastered after a short amount of time to create better contrast in your images. Most photographers opt to use an S-curve to start, where you drag the bottom quarter of the curve down, and then you create another point on the top of the curve and you drag up. This brightens the lighter spots in the image and darkens the darker spots in the image. Before you do this, be sure that your image is properly exposed, so increase the exposure if the image is too dark. I also like to drag the very bottom left spot on the curve up, which helps to bring back a slight amount of detail in the very darkest of the darks. The benefit of using the curve over the contrast slider is that the curve is totally customizable. Maybe you want to barely increase the brights, but you really want to darken the shadows to go for a moody look. Maybe you want to just increase the contrast in the highlights while protecting the shadows to give your image an extra punch while not totally drowning out the shadows and darkness. The possibilities really are endless, and this is by far the best way to add contrast to your image and keep a realistic look. Additionally, when we mention contrast, another pro tip for you guys is to add depth to your scenes to make them even more realistic, and you can do so by adding contrast to the foreground of the image and removing it from the background. To do this, you'll have to use a local adjustment, which I'm not going to be covering in this video, but this is an advanced way to create depth and add realism to your images if you already know how to make local adjustments. The next tip that I always recommend is to fine-tune your saturation sliders. First and foremost, don't overdo it. It's really easy to overcook the saturation in your image, which will absolutely ruin just about any photo. Many photographers make the mistake of adding too much saturation globally. I generally aim for around 20 vibrance and 10 saturation, of course positive, and then you can go in and make adjustments to individual colors, which you can then adjust further to get your desired look. One thing that I notice a lot of newer photographers make the mistake of is that their blues are too saturated. Oftentimes this happens without even adjusting the blue saturation. The shadows in your scene love to be blue, it seems like, so make sure they aren't too blue. As you add contrast to your scene, it can also increase the saturation of the colors, and it seems like the blues in the shadows are the first things to skyrocket as you increase contrast. In almost all my images, I'm reducing the blue saturation unless I have blue sky. If that's the case, I might use a local adjustment to reduce blue saturation in the foreground and not in the sky. Additionally, try increasing the luminance of certain key colors in your images to help make something stand out or pop. Lastly, you must make sure the colors of similar objects in your scene make sense. For some reason, I find a lot of my images where the sky will be different shades of blue on one side versus the other. Whether I used a polarizer or there's just a difference in light, who knows? But the difference is usually subtle, but if you want to create the most realistic looking images, you have to fix this and any other subtle problems that distract the viewer. Again, use a color adjustment to help adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance, then mask the adjustment to have uniformity across the sky. The third tip is pretty simple and straightforward, and that is to avoid using HDR. Most any full-frame camera made in the last 5 years has plenty of dynamic range that you shouldn't need to bracket your shots. Embrace the bright highlights and dark shadows in your frame. I've seen too many photos where the foreground that should be in shadow has been brought up in brightness so much that it's the same luminance value as the sky. Shadows should be kept dark and highlights should be kept bright, even if that comes at the expense of losing some detail in your image. Sure, I usually reduce the highlights a little bit and increase the shadows a little bit, but don't overdo it. You definitely don't want to be minus 100 highlights, plus 100 shadows. It's going to not look realistic. Besides, more details are not always better, and they can often lead to images that are just too busy. Most of my photography, I personally like to have something that is bright, oftentimes just clipping the right side of the histogram, as well as something that's very dark, oftentimes just clipping the left side of the histogram. Having the full spectrum of dynamic range in your image gives it a lot of depth in my opinion, and it helps the image to look more realistic. Tip number 4 is to chase the light. The more I shoot landscapes, the more I realize that light truly is king. I'll take soft dappled sunlight on my subject over a burner sunset 10 times out of 10. Sunlight adds depth, dimension, and helps you to get a more polished image straight out of the camera. This isn't to say that I don't ever do an exposure blend or blend great clouds with great light, but I generally do focus more on light than I do on the sunset. Now, when you capture images under the best light, it'll be easier for you to edit, meaning you'll spend less time behind the computer, meaning ultimately you'll less likely overcook your edit. You don't always have to shoot a sunset or sunrise, but using your wide angle lens in the middle of the day usually is not going to result in a compelling image, which oftentimes, unfortunately, will lead photographers to try and do something extreme with their edit, which results in a photo that just doesn't look good. Now, I did want to mention that I did just release a course earlier this week that relates to creating compelling and realistic looking images with my friends at On1 Photo Raw. The new course is called Mastering Realistic Landscapes. It shows you my whole editing workflow from start to finish. The editing process is obviously a major part of landscape photography, and in this course, I show you absolutely everything you need to know to edit realistic landscapes that have impact in On1. Now, if you're a current Lightroom and Photoshop user trying to get out of the monthly subscription, now might be a good time to jump on On1 and pick up my tutorial. You'll learn everything you need to know. And if you're already an On1 user, I don't hold anything back in this course, and you'll literally see how I edit my images in full. I'm going to be sure to leave a link down below for anyone who may be interested in picking up that course. Thank you guys so much for checking out this week's video. I really hope it was helpful for you. Creating realistic images that have impact is a challenge for many, and it's certainly something that I struggled with for years, and I will always be perfecting and improving. I truly hope my advice will help you on your journey to avoid some of the pitfalls that I fell victim to. If you guys have any questions or comments, let me know down below. And additionally, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, because I post weekly videos that are aiming to help you become a better landscape photographer. Thank you guys again so much for watching. We'll see you guys next time.